and he missed the fact that I do like dancing too. And
Oh,
as you
yeah.
can see, I've been in Brazil before, and this, I don't know why SugarLoafPLoP likes to always have these nice places where you have the conferences, but they definitely, that is in Porto de Colinas. That might have been the third or the fourth SugarLoafPLoP that they had there. We had two in Porto de Colinas and a couple in Fortaleza, I think. But actually, I think Agile Brazil next year is going to be in Porto de Colinas as well. But that was one of the early ones. Rosanna was at this one. This was one of the early SugarLoafPLoPs. But I've been involved with patterns for quite a long time. I wanted to at least give you a little bit of background, but not the background that Eduardo gave you, but what influences my thinking, at least from patterns and Agile and things that I'm going to present, because I think sometimes, my biases, what types of things that I grew up with, it influences some of my fast thinking or reactionary thinking versus my slow thinking. And so I grew up with these mugs here, this gang here. One of them is the gang from a member from the Gang of Four, but really I call it like kind of the refactoring dudes. It was from the University of Illinois Software Architecture Group in the early 90s, and we were studying what makes good software architecture at the time. We were reviewing a lot of papers. Some people were doing their work with Ralph on refactoring. Actually, this is probably one of the best hackers I've ever worked with, John Brandt. Him and Don Roberts did the first commercial refactoring tools. A lot of cool things going on. There's Brian Foote, who I've collaborated with a lot. And really, I feel kind of fortunate that I was in the right place at the right time. Actually, I was doing my work originally with somebody else in the computer science department. He left, he went into industry all of a sudden, and I was lucky enough to take Ralph's Smalltalk class and get excited about that, and then started doing a lot of work with a lot of these people. But we were really studying with what makes good designs. And in fact, part of our group is we constantly look at systems or papers and things that people wrote, and we were trying to study what makes good architecture. And in fact, something in one of the early patterns conferences, Brian Foote and I wrote this, what I consider one of my favorite papers, even though I'm better known much for a different paper, but it's called The Selfish Class. And we were trying to take a perspective. Imagine you're a piece of software and you want to live. What kind of attributes can you have to survive and live a good thing? And so, for example, a couple patterns that we had in there. Imagine if you want to be a good reusable component, just you see an open source today, it works out of the box. You get it, it works right away, you plug it in, it's easy to use, and there's a lot of examples. We also had another one that's actually focused even in the physical world, like low surface to volume ratio. A sphere is one of the best that you get with that. But like a software component, from how we noticed that, was things like, okay, the surface is kind of the API of how you're using it, and Brian and I were using examples from that. But you get a lot of utility from a pretty easy, simple to use interface. And we even had things like fold-out interfaces. We had all kinds of good patterns of how you could write software, but taking a kind of a more of an approach of thinking what you have to add, what kind of attributes would your software have in order to survive in the long run. But lo and behold, one thing Brian and I noticed when we wrote this is that some components and some things survive. As we were researching and looking at all this, that when they're really a mess, for some reason, some things have a survival rate and tend to live a long life, even if it's big, ugly spaghetti code. And for example, it's kind of scary, but the thing that I'm best known for is this publication, Big Balls of Mud. The most successful architecture still deployed today. And we were looking at why that happens. In fact, when we first published this paper and put it online, we got slashed on it so hard that it brought our server, pretty much it was hard to get stuff because everybody was hitting it. It became something that everybody could relate to. But why does worse win? And we've seen lots of examples all over society. Why did, VHS kind of went over Beta? I mean, clearly Beta had a lot of superior things back in the 80s even at that point. Why back in the late 80s and early 90s was Microsoft doing somewhat better with Windows than Macintosh, who clearly at that time had a much better user experience from that. And in fact, one of the things that was interesting is some of you from Brazil may know what this picture is, right? What's that a picture of? Brasilia, a city by design. And just like Washington, D.C., most cities are not just well laid out way ahead of time. But Brasilia was, and Washington DC was. They said, this is how we want it, here's all this. But even when you have a city by design, a lot of times through time, as the city becomes alive and changes, natural things tend to kind of change the city. You have urban decay and things like that. In fact, we were trying to look at why do, even though we try to design our software systems, why do they end up more like these shanty towns than these nice design things, or like Frank Lloyd's Wright Mile High building that never got built. It was almost too expensive to buy that in there. So why do what we practice and what we preach quite so different? And there's some natural forces to lead to this. In fact, even it was interesting, last year I was in Brasilia and gave a talk about Big Ball of Mud, which this is not about. I'm just giving you the background that leads up to building quality software. Is here I was in the city we had mentioned in our paper, and I went to your National Library. And your National Library was designed ahead of time. But you go in there and there's no books. And I'm like, why are there no books in the National Library in Brasilia? Well, because the building, they misinterpreted the fact that they built it so that it, the structure, you can't handle all the books. So imagine that, that's kind of like any software projects we've thought of, or any kind of project. There was a design, but it was a misinterpretation of what we needed, and then you build your National Library cannot hold books. Now that's changed recently because e-books, now you can get a few kind of e-books in there. But if you try to put a big catalog of books, the building would fall down. It's a nice building, so it was designed kind of nice architecturally, but it was not designed with the strength to hold a lot of books. And even when you get into Brasilia, even though it's got this, hopefully nobody takes this wrong, but it's kind of a boring city for me, because it's just kind of duplicated, all laid out the same. Whereas when I've gone to some other interesting cities, it's got some more interesting architectures than some of the older cities in Brazil I've been in. Whereas this city's okay, but in a sense, and even then around the city, there's a lot of urban decay kind of coming up. And similarly in Washington, D.C., you have some similar things going on. So why does this happen? What kind of forces? And we talked about a lot of things that cause that, and I'm not going to talk about those here, but how about Agile? And in fact, Agile came out or what we call Agile, and when they did the Agile Manifesto, it came out mostly from people in the patterns community. Almost all the people that did the Agile Manifesto and were involved with the early writings of that and started the big Agile movement, when you look at all those people and who they were, almost all of them were in the patterns community and from the O community at the time. And one of the things that they were trying to do is we need a better way to build quality software and focus on quality with that. And so how can, maybe Agile is a way to rescue us. Maybe it can rescue us from the murks, from the muddy type of architecture. Maybe we can do better with this. And Agile, so I want to talk a little bit about Agile and Quality, because Agile kind of came to do this. And in fact, Agile has a lot of these core design values when you really look at what Agile was about and the mindset of the Agile community. I was just in Agile Brazil in Florianopolis last week, and there was lots of people from all over Brazil. It's definitely a growing movement. I think some of the early stuff was done by these two guys right here. In about 2002, 2003, there was really no Agile down here. You guys and other people as well really started, but now it's really taken off with some of the ideas. But a lot of it is really we want to kind of have teams working together. We're going to empower people to do the right thing. And we're going to learn, constantly retrospect and learn. And we're trying to really build quality software and be able to adapt to changing environments that happen all the time. And one thing that Agile did, which even in the early refactoring work that was done with Ralph Johnson with some of the early PhDs, but even what they talked about is testing was core to that. But a lot of the software community, testing would happen, but it would happen with QA more at the end of the process rather than early on. Whereas we talked about if you're going to safely refactor, what was key to that is being able to validate that what you didn't break what went on. And so that was a core principle of that. So there's all these design values when we're trying to do Agile that's important to do that. Good. And one of the things when you look at Agile teams nowadays though, and I go to a lot of the Agile conferences, or I go to do consulting with Agile, a lot of Agile people, they're focused on functional requirements. We have a product owner, and the product owner talks about, here's our functional requirements. Very rarely do they talk about system qualities and the different types of qualities that we want. You know, and in the quality of the software, oh, who cares? I mean, does that end to the end user? You know, even Kent Beck in his one book, Talking Implementation Patterns, Kent Beck talks about that book is built on a fragile premise, that quality code matters, because we've seen too much bad code make too much money to know that quality code is important to success. Those of us that have to live there and maintain these systems think that that's important. But I think what's even more important than even the quality of the code, which I think is something to look at, is also even certain system qualities. Because sometimes the Agile, we get this feeling that, you know, we're focusing mostly on the functional side. Does it calculate the invoice correctly? Can I add more than one note? Or as a reviewer, I can do this. But quite often there's a lot of other qualities that get put off and don't worry about. We'll just let the architecture emerge. It'll magically emerge somehow if we just keep doing these sprints and keep refactoring. It will get better. It will magically appear, the beautiful architecture. You know, and a lot of times people call, I don't like the word non-functional, but that's what everybody uses in the software world, so I put it up there. But I mean, to me, if it's a requirement, I don't care what it is, but it's usually the illities that people look like. These system qualities are things like, you know, reliability or extensibility or scalability. And you know, some of these, I've learned the hard way that some of these, if you wait till the last possible moment to consider some of these important requirements, it has a tendency to really cause a lot of upheaval in your system and can really tear it apart. I even have an example of this where even when I was doing research with Ralph in the 90s with Caterpillar, where we were working on this financial model, and they ended up really liking the system, and now they wanted security because it had to deal with money. And so then I had to refactor the system and kind of adding a lot of security in. And at that time, that ended up kind of causing a lot of upheaval and kind of it caused a lot of code changes that I was involved with making as I was working on the system. Yes?
I would say that at the start of the project, we asked them, does this need to be secure? And they said, no, it does not need to be secure. It's not part of the accounting system. All it's going to be doing is taking data and then displaying. It's not actually going to be generating anything or changing, so that it does not have to be secure.
Right.
So we asked them that a number of times, and everybody kept telling us, no, it doesn't have to be secure, it does not have to be secure, so we didn't worry about it too much.
Right. But your roadmap for, if you're doing Agile, you still usually have a roadmap. You might say that after a few sprints, since we know we have to have a very high performance, maybe we need to start thinking about that types of things. But one of the problems with some of the illities is design is always about trade-offs. You know, it's not just as Ralph was talking earlier with some of the design patterns. When you're doing design, sometimes there's trade-offs on using one pattern over the other, and just like performance versus small memory or security versus user interface. If we want this, you know, if both of those are system qualities, well, if you want it very nice user interface, get rid of security. You don't have to have any kind of checks or other things going on. And so when we're doing this design, a lot depends upon whose perspective are you looking at. Now, is it the users of the system? They might, from their perspective of quality, how easy and how nice does it do what I want, help me with my job? Whereas if you're the CEO or the CFO, hey, is it doing our company good? Does it not cost too much to build and maintain versus the users are happy and we're getting a good return on our investment? Whereas if you're the developer or the person maintaining the system, your quality might be, wow, how easy it is for me to add new requirements or change the system. Are there some things? So one of the problems with some of these qualities is depending on whose perspective that you're looking at. You know, and it's about trade-offs. Now, QA's been around for a while. In fact, in manufacturing, long before we've had any software, they've been looking at QA for a real long time. You know, and QA has a lot of good experienced people, at least for looking at some of these different types of qualities that we can use for thinking about the system. But one of the problems, it's almost a tragedy. You know, it's very sad that in the software world, QA is most of the time, in most industries that I've looked at, not always, but most of the time, it's really more like QC. Now QA means quality assurance, QC is quality control. Now, in a past life, before I was ever involved with software, I did some work in manufacturing and I was involved with QA. And from manufacturing, just like if you look at Toyota, with the lean type process, with what Japan does, they've done a great job of figuring this out from manufacturing. And this has really been accepted all over the world from manufacturing. From the lean process, we're building quality in all the way through the process. That quality mindset should be from everybody working on the team together. From the developer, from the people plugging the parts together, from any type of thing, from the engineer. And I remember when I was involved with QA and manufacturing, we were working from the get-go. It wasn't just a gate. You still had your gatekeepers at the end, but you also had that quality mindset all the way through. And we can do some of that. Unfortunately, a lot of QA groups are working independently rather than with, at least in software. They're usually like separate rooms. Let's keep them away. It's bad if they mix. They might bias each other's thinking. Man, developers might convince QA to let this slide by, so we better keep them in their own area. But they have a lot of good experiences. They understand testing well too. They usually know how to really test certain types of qualities and things that sometimes developers don't even think of. Now, so I want to start using this is how can we use it, learn from some of this and change some of this. So being Agile at Quality is something that I've been working on quite a few patterns this year with a lot of people, and ultimately we want to put together the best practices. Because if you go to most Agile conferences or you talk to most people in Agile and industry, they always talk about what the developers need to do, how you manage the teams. You even can certify product owners. You can have certified product developers if you're doing Scrum or whatever. Not that that makes you Agile. Agile is more of a way of thinking. But what does QA do? And so QA a lot of times, especially these larger organizations, have to figure out how do they fit into an Agile team. And some people, and there's a lot of good experience reports that's been written recently, are starting to figure that out. We want to kind of start influencing the mindset so that when people are going out there and transitioning, or you're trying to become Agile, how can we also do that quality? One of the core, I'm not going to say much about this because this is a pattern I have that I'm going to get some review on today, but this is one of the ones, is you have to tear down the walls. You really have to overcome barriers. So a lot of times there's cultural barriers. It could be cultural barriers because of language, but it could be even where we grew up. If you're more from testing or from that QA mindset, whereas if you're more from the Agile development team mindset, sometimes it's different. So we have to overcome those barriers, and we have to get ways to move through that. So some of the, I'm not going to go, it ended up that so far we brainstormed, me and Rebecca and a few other people I've collaborated with, we ended up with coming up with 23 patterns, and it's not 23 because the design patterns happens to have 23. It's more coincidental at this time. In fact, we're not happy with that number, that it just magically turned to 23, but there might be 25 or 28 or whatever. But we're really trying to write the best practices and come up when we do this. And so this, but one thing that's core, and one thing we think that we didn't even have this one a few sprints ago, if you want to use the term sprints from Agile. But after we started writing some of these and we got feedback from people at writers' workshops, this is one of the patterns that emerged. It's core. Before you can do anything, you have to overcome the obstacles. But one thing once you start getting going is if you really want to be Agile quality, you have to make quality part of your whole process. And you have to put things together. So for example, imagine you have a Scrum process. It's like I'm supposed to commit a lobotomy and I'm supposed to go off there and do Agile without even thinking. It's important to at least think, are we building the right thing? But even once you've envisioned the right thing, now we're going to get into the regular sprints of TDD. And whether you're doing it with Scrum with 2-week cycles or whatever, you can still do a little bit of thinking and think about what qualities might fit in as part of this sprint as well. And you still have some fast TDD, but you still, maybe your pair programming, that's a little bit of modeling, refactoring, that's a little bit of slow thinking and thinking about how to clean up what we've been doing. But maybe we're beginning a 2-week sprint and we spend a few hours doing a little bit of brainstorming. Are there qualities that fit into this sprint that we should think about? In fact, some people even have QA people. I was at a company last week in Moringa, the objective people that went to Moringa, all these different types of things. We don't want like a lot of these experts. That's how Agile teams generally say. They really focus on good communication. We're going to learn a lot, and it's the whole team. The whole team working together. They're supposed to be, the best Agile teams are considered self-organizing. That everybody preaches that, very few practice it. But everybody preaches to be self-organizing. That was one cool thing I saw with that Vegas.com down in Sao Paulo last week. They were totally self-organizing. There's no project leads or anything. All the teams, there's no managers on any of the teams. But they're very productive, and they've been growing at 25% a year for over a dozen years, even in the downtime the last few years, and the economy's been a little slow here.
I just wonder what the average experience rate is of, say, the 20% least experienced people. I mean, I bet that they don't hire people who are like right out of college.
No, they generally don't. In fact, you know what? They write software for how to hire people.
Yeah.
And how to, yeah, that's what their business model is
Because I've
about.
seen groups that were completely self-organized, but the reason was you could have
You put your resume there.
you could have picked any person on the team and said, you're the project manager, and they could have done it at the average company. So when you take all people who could do that, well then,
Yeah.
they don't need managers.
Yeah. And there are a lot of Ruby developers too. It's a little bit of different, but it's really open. In fact, the main owner of the company's office is there, and some of the people need to use his office while he's out. The door, it's always open, everything's open door. They just walk in, and anything's open anytime to do anything.
So but let me just sort of object to this. The problem is that, let's say you're really concerned about doing stuff at that scale, and you want to be able to handle 1 million simultaneous users. So go to your team. Who on this team has ever handled 1 million simultaneous users? Anybody here ever wrote anything to handle 1 million simultaneous? So,
What's the time?
anybody in this room ever written software that had 1 million simultaneous users? Okay, I mean, there's
One person kind of.
Okay, so, but
That's
the
good.
point is, you take a typical team at someplace, and no one has ever
That's
done
right.
that before. And so, I've read papers about it.
Right.
Does that make me capable of designing that software?
No.
It certainly, reading papers is better than having no clue
That's
at
right.
all. But still, in a situation like that, you're better off hiring an expert.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you said that, because that led exactly to what I believe. I believe that there's a problem with most Agile thinking. It's okay to have experts occasionally. It's okay to have a quality expert. So Agile quality teams, it's okay to have QA people. Some QA people don't want to be writing code, but they love testing, and they're experts at testing these types of things. So it's okay to hire an expert that handles 1 million transactions. And so I think some of that mindset just think that we can always have cross-functional teams. Sure, that's nice to have, but occasionally it pays off to bring the expert in. And so that's what's key to if you want to have more of an Agile quality type team.
And going back to your page of abilities, is there anybody who actually understands all of those?
No.
I doubt it. So you're going to find, if all these things are potentially important, I mean, the likelihood of being able to get a team that is capable of doing everything that's needed is small. That's sort of the problem.
That's why you bring in who you need when you need from that. So basically, with an Agile team, almost all organizations want to build quality, but a lot of times it's like, we'll just worry about, we have this QA team, and unfortunately they don't think about the qualities until way late in the game. And so if we can build that in early, if we know that that's core to our requirements, is to building 1 million simultaneous users, we should think about that. And we might want to go hire this guy. If it was our team, this is the one closest to what we need. So let's hire you and bring you into our team and guide us, because you have some learning expertise of things we should consider. Similarly, if we need security, well then we would find whoever the security expert is. And so it's important to think about those types of things, but you can still be Agile and do that. That's what my complaint is a lot of times Agile is preaching that you have to be exactly like this. Well, this isn't Agile, this is rigid. I'm going to be Agile if I only can, if you're Agile, it's the people doing the best thing